Okay, we would like to know if you consider if it's possible to combine journalism and games.
So journalism and games is a really interesting space, right? Because there's a question that comes up whenever you deal with journalism about truth and like what constitutes journalistic truth. And that becomes this very heavy question. So like a simple example, whenever I teach in journalism classes, I always go to this example right away. Take the banking crisis that happened in the US in 2008, right?
Yeah.
Imagine that I made a game in which you were a banker. You're not a real banker. I don't take a real person, but I model the company after Lehman Brothers. I make you exactly like a banker in Lehman Brothers. I put you under exactly the same pressures and I run the stock market exactly the same way. And I let you make decisions as a banker. And by that, I teach you how the crisis happened at the level of an individual banker. Did I make a work of journalism? And when you do that, half the class says yes, because it was all based on fact, and you put somebody in the shoes of somebody who was there, so it was like telling the story. And half the class says no, because the banker never existed. So I think that games have a really interesting space, and game-like things have a really interesting space in journalism, but journalism is going through a kind of crisis right now with interactives of figuring out like, okay, when we talk about journalistic truth, what of interactive stuff can count? And I think it's a good question. Like, I'm not taking a side on that. It's not a side I can take because I'm not a journalist. But I think journalists have to solve for themselves, like what kinds of levels of choice are fair? What is still true? Where can we give people freedom to explore? And what will that look like when we get to the other side? And I think it's not different than what happened in documentary when we started using reenactment. And there was like a crisis in journalism of like, is a reenactment a valid expression of truth? And we eventually decided yes. And we kind of decided yes because people just did it. And eventually everybody just accepted it. But I'm wondering about what form that's going to take. What I do think, though, is that games are very good at telling stories of complex systems. Because games embody complex systems, which is the best way to understand a complex system. And so I think that as you think about systems of politics, systems of society, systems of economies, systems of complex relationships of different forces, I think that a game is a very effective way to communicate those relationships to people, and in fact better than film or writing can. And so I think that certainly journalism should be looking at games and game-like things as ways of sort of elucidating those systems, if not as the primary means, but as a supplemental means that can give some kind of like intuitive understanding.
So the conclusion is that do you think it's difficult to create a non-fiction game for a story for people?
I definitely do not think it's difficult to create a non-fiction game to tell a story. I think a lot of people have done it and they do it well. I think the question is, would those non-fiction stories rise to the level of accuracy that journalism requires? Right? I think that's really the kind of deep question. Like what's interesting is transmedia in film is largely pushed forward by documentary. Like there actually isn't that much fiction transmedia. There's much more transmedia in documentary because I think documentarians see the films as instrumental, right? It's like my goal in making this film is to make a good film, but really my goal is to expose this truth about banking, or to talk about dolphins, or to get people to pay attention to this population in this area, right? Like I'm sure, I know Viceland wants to sell ads through the Charlottesville piece, but they'd be perfectly happy if people just knew that neo-Nazis existed, right? So I think that relationship is very, very strong. And I think journalism wants to figure it out. There's just some like inherent issues that journalism has. Some of them are with ethics, and then the other is just speed, right? Like journalism has to happen quickly often. And so it relies on media that can be templated and move very fast, right? So like video, audio recording, text. These are things that the standards are pretty locked. We know what we're building towards. Like we're building something towards a 2-minute segment. We're building something towards like a 45-second sting on an audio cast. We're building something towards a 500-word piece. There's a lot of flexibility in that form because like what you can fit in 45 seconds of audio is a lot, right? And it can be very different. And a lot of interactivity is very bespoke. So like the idea that you're gonna like do something about a crisis that happened on Tuesday by Thursday with an interactive is a little bit crazy. But it then leads to other questions like, can we template some interactives? Maybe there are some things we could like templatize and then just plug content into. Or maybe we save this for like super bespoke stuff, like, if we do a long investigative piece, maybe that gets an interactive because that will need the interactive that way. Like, so I'm sorry, these aren't simple answers. I think it's like a really complicated, interesting question. I mean, I'm working in stuff in journalism right now. I'm doing an interactive around journalism like right now, and I have all of these ideas of things I want to do. I'm just curious to see like what journalists will consider journalism and what will be acceptable.
It's interesting because it's probably with this kind of it's difficult to say with these new forms to tell things and stories. We get to new audience like millennials and centennials and something that probably before didn't listen or didn't know this kind of stories.
No, and I think it's true that new audiences are looking for the media they understand to understand the world. So like if you're not making short videos for social media, I don't know why you're making videos right now, because like that's clearly how people are consuming videos who are younger and who grew up with that understanding. But I also feel like it's a lot of, and Ben's going to talk about this in a second, but like I feel like a lot of it is sort of targeting the most useful way to communicate information, and I'm really just quoting him right now because he literally just said that to me. But to me, that's really powerful. Like one of the things I'm very interested in is the role of data visualization in journalism, and how I think that some of the most powerful kinds of journalism I've seen recently are just data visualizations of like just telling me facts in a way that's like narrative and interesting. So I wonder, like, a lot of those things aren't that hard to make. Like, could you churn out interactives quite quickly? Maybe you could do them in like 1 month, and then you just push them out into the world, and you could tell news that way. And that's something that I feel like, oh, that would work with audiences that are not as interested in like reading long things. But then I think when we do this, we also just forget the way newspaper articles are written. They're written so that the first paragraph has all the important information, so if you don't read the rest of it, you're fine. We've always known that people have low attention spans. We've always known that you have to get, in a news broadcast, you have to get the headline out first, because you don't know what people are going to stick around for or pay attention to. So I think it's just updating that to the technologies we understand today and creating the relationships that make sense.